the board. He is on the board of the Wintonbury Historical Society, and he is going to lead this presentation today.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Bloomfield. My name again is David Runas. I'm a member of the Wintonbury Historical Society committee, which includes John Capadona, Libby Merrow, and Mara Whitman. Thanks to a grant, an access grant from the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving to address the legacies of discrimination in telling the story of our town, the four of us were able to research the history of slavery in colonial Bloomfield through the stories of Jenny, Ceasar, and Peter. Again, I want to thank the Bloomfield Public Library and the Wintonbury Historical Society for sponsoring this webinar. You have probably seen this statue of the drummer boy on the town green in Bloomfield. It commemorates the fact that two members of the Brown family manufactured drums here in our town that were used by the colonial army during the Revolutionary War. Drums are a good way of calling attention to important events, and perhaps the drummer is calling our attention to a rather untold part of our town's history. I do know from church records that a young boy named Jefferson Brown died at the age of 14 in 1835. The church record refers to him as colored. So I'm not sure yet if he was perhaps a free Black person or maybe an indentured servant serving one of the families in our town, or perhaps an enslaved teenager kidnapped from Africa, who might have taken the surname of the family that enslaved him. More work needs to be done on that. I do know for a fact, based on what I've read in the book From Wintonbury to Bloomfield, that the patriarch of the Brown family was Peter Brown, who was the great-great-great-grandfather of John Brown, the abolitionist who led the attack on Harper's Ferry, the arsenal there that sort of kicked off the Civil War. He died in his effort to free the slaves down south. That kind of reminds me that our town's relationship to slavery is very complicated. And I think it's important that we tell the whole story, not just the pretty virtuous things that happened in our town, but also some of the vices, perhaps. Both are part of our past and have shaped our current history. Many people are surprised to learn that there really was slavery in Bloomfield and in Connecticut. Our research over the past few months has helped us to shift our gaze about the colonial story of our town. I'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, and again, you can ask questions in the chat function, and Tracy Wilson will try to answer your questions while I'm speaking. Again, there'll be an opportunity, hopefully at the end of this presentation, for you to ask additional questions. Tracy is a history consultant with the Noah Webster House, who has studied, researched, and amplified the story of slavery in West Hartford. She and her team have shared their expertise with our committee. Many of the materials that are used here are primary sources, including church records, probate records, census records, as well as land records. There may very well be more records to help fill in the story. With what we have found so far, we have made an important start on changing how we tell the story of colonial Wintonbury. Have you seen this mural on Park Avenue? It was painted about 2 years ago. And at the unveiling, Anika Noni Rose came to be honored. I just want you to hear what she said, quote, "Something hugely amazing happened to me yesterday. And I've just been sitting with the enormous feeling. For Juneteenth, my hometown of Bloomfield unveiled a wall on the side of the Alvin and Beatrice Wood Human Services Center, honoring Black accomplishment in the space of civil rights and achievement. That is my face between President Barack Obama and Martin Luther King Jr. My face adjacent to fellow hometown hero Dwight Freeney and Vice President Kamala Harris. When your hometown honors you in this way, it's hard to even put into words how it feels. But the easiest word is seen. So very seen. I am so full," end quote. That is the story that we are trying to tell about slavery. We want Jenny, Caesar, and Peter to be seen and to be an integral part of the story of colonial Bloomfield. Bloomfield was first known as Wintonbury Parish because the land that was used to create the parish was taken from Windsor, farming ton, and Simsbury, hence Wintonbury. The parish was created to support the Congregational Church, which held its first meeting on February 14th, 1738. The first records of that church were handwritten by its pastor, Reverend Hezekiah Bissell, who was ordained one day after the church began. On July 19th, 1772, he recorded the baptism of, quote, "Ceasar, a Negro servant of mine." On the same day, Levi, a child of Daniel Pettibone, and Lyman and Clarice, twin children of Ebenezer Drake, were also baptized. Does it surprise you that a pastor would enslave another human being? It was actually quite common in colonial Connecticut. Note that Caesar's father is not listed in this document. Was he even consulted about the baptism of his son? I wonder, as Caesar got older, how much did he really participate in the life of the Congregational Church? Did you notice that Caesar is called Reverend Bissell's Negro servant of mine? Is there perhaps a hint of pride of ownership in that statement? Did the pastor use the word servant because he sensed perhaps that slavery was wrong? Servant may conjure up an image of a Black nanny caring for the white children of her mistress in their nursery, or a Black butler helping his wealthy master don a dinner jacket, but that would not be accurate. In his expose on slavery in New England, Jared Hardesty wrote, quote, "For most New Englanders, profits from farming stony soil or working in developing urban economies were meager. With such earnings, it was hard to purchase bound labor, enslaved or indentured, and most families relied on the work of their own children, which also accounts for why white New Englanders had so many kids. Small profits and large families further help explain why slaveholding remained relatively limited, usually with families owning no more than 1 or 2 slaves in New England. That's Hardesty, Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds, page 71. Reverend Bissell married Mary Woodbridge on November 20th, 1740. She was the daughter of Reverend Ephraim Woodbridge of Groton, Connecticut. In 1750, their home was built on what is now 669 Bloomfield Avenue. At that time, the road was called Bissell Street. The garage, of course, was added later, and there's a shed from the original home in back of that garage, I'm told. Pastor Bissell died on January 28, 1783. He is buried in this brick crypt in the old Wintonbury Cemetery on Tunxus Avenue, just north of the church. This glowing tribute atop his grave praises Hezekiah's character. There is no mention of the fact that he enslaved a boy, and as we will soon see, also a Black woman. While we know much about Reverend Bissell, we know very little about Ceasar, the child that he enslaved. This is a painting of the first meeting house of the Congregational Church. Erected in 1738, it was never fully finished. This is where Ceasar was baptized in 1772. Henry Stiles described this as, quote, a plain barn-like structure, unpainted, with no steeple or the slightest mark to distinguish it as a church. In the gallery was a high pew set apart for colored persons. All the men sat on one side of the church and all the women on the other. That's Stiles in his History of Ancient Windsor, Volume 1, page 293. So let me rephrase that. The white church members were seated according to their gender. The enslaved were put at the back of the sanctuary based on the color of their skin. That may sound like the Jim Crow South in the 1940s, but this was colonial Wintonbury. Can we even guess how Ceasar may have felt as he experienced this type of segregation in worship? A second house of worship was built in 1801 on the same site, and a third in 1858. Those buildings also had balconies. The so-called colored bench was eventually moved from the top of the balcony to below it. Reverend Roscoe Metzger, while celebrating the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Congregational Church, wrote the following: it seems to be pretty generally agreed that there may have been as many as a dozen men and women, boys and girls, who were held as slaves in Wintonbury, Bloomfield during the 18th century. They were expected to go to church, to be baptized, and to be instructed in the meanings of the Christian gospel. But there was a peculiar blindness in all of this. When they went to church, they sat under the stairs, wherever that may have been, It was agreed that they were immortal souls, but their bodies could be bought and sold. And when they heard the gospel, it was to be understood as pie in the sky, not as human freedom here and now in this world. And when they died, they were buried off in a secluded corner of the cemetery. On May 15th, 1780, Reverend Bissell wrote out his will. He left to his wife, Mary, all his land and the buildings on it, and his stock of dairy cattle, swine, and sheep, among other things. To his daughter, Mary, he gave his mare, side saddle, and bridle, and 2 of his cows, plus other goods. To his son, Hezekiah Woodbridge Bissell, Esquire, he gave, quote, all my wearing apparel and books and pamphlets, and half of his land after the decease of the Reverend's wife, Mary. On that same day, Reverend Bissell wrote out an appendix to his will, stipulating how his property would be divided between his son and daughter. Quote, also I give to my said son my whole stock of creatures of all sorts after the decease of my wife, except the 2 cows and mare devised to my daughter Mary. There was no mention of Caesar in the pastor's will or its appendix. However, an inventory of his estate was made on May 16th, 1783. The very first line reads, quote, sundry articles of apparel valued at 15 pounds, 16 shillings, servant boy Caesar, valued at 70 pounds. Total for that line, 85 pounds, 16 shillings. The list continues with the side saddle, bridle, and horse tackle, followed by a list of livestock on the farm. This is conjecture on my part, but the inference seems pretty clear. At 70 pounds, Caesar was regarded as a valuable piece of property. In comparison, the Bissell's barn was valued at only 20 pounds and their home at 90. So why isn't Caesar mentioned by name in Reverend Bissell's will? I believe the boy was understood to be part of the pastor's, quote, stock of creatures. Because Caesar is still called a boy in the inventory 11 years after his baptism, he must have been baptized when he was an infant. The inventory of the estate is helpful because it hints at how Caesar may have worked for the family that enslaved him. Reverend Bissell owned a working farm with 50 acres of land on the west side of Bissell Street and 20 acres on the east side, a house, a barn, a horse, 7 cows, 3 hogs, and 4 pigs, and 10 sheep. Recall that Jared Hardesty noted that enslaved people in New England labored beside the children on the family farm. Well, Reverend and Mrs. Bissell had 3 children who died young, so they lacked workers to run their farm. Caesar would have labored beside their one child who was still at home, Mary. We might imagine Caesar cutting hay, planting and harvesting corn, plowing a field using the mare, watering vegetables with a bucket, picking apples and berries, or chopping wood. Henry Stiles quoted Reverend William Miller, who was the third pastor of the Congregational Church, who wrote in 1801 that wood and hay were the chief marketable products of Wintonbury Parish, and that cider, brandy, and apples are considered market articles. Also that 1,500 meat casks consisting of hogsheads, barrels, and tierces were made and marketed in that year. Stiles continued, "It is within the memory of a few still living that corn was raised here for exportation to the West Indies. A great change, however, has taken place in the last 40 years, owing to tobacco having usurped the place of grass and grains." Our town in colonial times appears to have been part of a global network trafficking in captured Native Americans and Africans. Anne Farrow, Joel Lang, and Jennifer Frank wrote, quote, "The flow of commerce between America, Africa, and the West Indies entered history as the triangle trade. In its classic shape, northern colonies sent food, livestock, and wood, especially for barrels, to West Indian sugar plantations, where enslaved Africans harvested the cane that fed the refining mills. Sugar and its byproduct molasses was then shipped back north, usually in barrels made of New England wood, and sometimes accompanied by slaves. Finally, scores of northern distilleries turned the molasses into rum to trade in Africa for new slaves who were in turn shipped to the sugar plantations. That's in their book, Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery, page 48 and following. There is no further mention of Caesar after the 1783 inventory of Reverend Bissell's estate. His story ends with a question mark. Did he die? Was he sold to someone else? Was he set free? We simply don't know. I call your attention to item 469 in the top left of the church records, written by Reverend Bissell. April 1st, 1759, baptized Jenny, my Negro girl. We don't know how old she was when she had her head sprinkled with water. Girl might cover any age from an infant to a teenager. At that time, the Bissells had only one surviving child, Hezekiah Woodbridge Bissell, who was just shy of 16 years old. If she was still enslaved by the Bissells when Caesar was baptized in July 1772, 13 years would have passed. Is it possible that Jenny was Caesar's mother? Is that why they're in the same household? We don't know. This is the sole reference to this particular enslaved woman. Like Caesar and the other enslaved church members, Jenny would have sat in the balcony of the original congregational house of worship. As a farmhand, did Jenny milk the cows, feed the pigs, make candles, butter, and cheese, weave baskets, spin wool, preserve the farm's berries and vegetables? That might seem like a reasonable assumption. The woman in this picture isn't Jenny, but it's a painting of Nancy Toney, who was enslaved by the Loomis family in Windsor. The third person enslaved by a member of the Bissell family was Peter. This is an ad from the Connecticut Current on April 17th, 1790. Runaway from the subscribe of the 16th instant, a short, thick, and well-made Negro fellow named Peter talks good English, very well looking for his color, etc. Whoever will take up said Negro and return him to the subscriber shall have $6 and all necessary charges paid, by Hezekiah Bissell, East Windsor. Such runaway ads were common in the colonial Hartford newspaper. Here are two even more disturbing ads for slave auctions placed in the Connecticut Current. To be sold, a good, healthy Negro wench, about 25 years of age, who understands all kinds of housework, with a female child 8 months old. Enquire of the Printers, Hartford, April 5th, 1783. Take notice. To be sold, a very likely spry Negro girl, about 12 years old. Enquire of the subscriber John Kirby, Middletown, March 25th, 1783. The newspaper was complicit in the institution of slavery, along with the church and the town's economy. Some historians claim that slavery in New England was less cruel than its counterpart in the South. But we might ask ourselves why the enslaved ran away from their enslavers if life was so good for them. Would any of us cooperate with a system that tore wives from their husbands and children from their mothers and fathers? In 2000, the Hartford Current, which is the successor to the Connecticut Current, apologized for its role in this inhuman business. I'm fairly certain that the man who placed the runaway ad for Peter in the Current was Captain Hezekiah Bissell of East Windsor, who was a cousin of Hezekiah Woodridge Bissell, the Reverend's son. Captain Bissell served in the French and Indian War and in the Revolutionary War. The two cousins share a common ancestor, John Bissell, who settled in Windsor about 1638 and ran a ferry across the Connecticut River. The Reverend's family came from John's son, Nathaniel. The captain's family came through John's other son, also named John. The 1790 census for East Windsor shows that there were 10 people in the captain's home, including one who was enslaved. That unnamed person was probably Peter, who ran away in April 1790. The census was taken on August 2nd. Was Peter captured and returned to Captain Bissell? The Daughters of the American Revolution put together a list of enslaved men who served in the war, which they titled Forgotten Patriots. Second from the bottom is Peter from East Windsor. Is this the Peter who ran away from Captain Bissell? Both men would have fought for the ideal that all men are endowed by their Creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Slavery seems inconsistent with that ideal. By continuing to enslave Peter, Captain Bissell was bucking the tide of public opinion. Jared Hardesty noted that in 1774, Connecticut had 6,464 slaves, quote, the largest population in New England. By the time of the 1790 census, that number fell to 2,764. In 1800, only 951 slaves remained in our state. There were many reasons, economic and political, for this drop, but chief among them were the efforts of Black veterans who agitated for the end of slavery, and a growing feeling among some enslavers that slavery was contrary to the ideal of liberty for all. See Hardesty in his work cited page 141. Sadly, Peter disappears from the historical record. We don't know how his story ends. But I hope that the stories of Ceasar, Jenny, and Peter, although incomplete, reveal that the problem of slavery was not confined to the southern United States. Slavery in Connecticut in colonial times was part of a brutal system that dehumanized both the enslaved and the enslavers. We will now hopefully entertain some questions if we have time. So how do the stories of Ceasar, Jenny, and Peter make you think differently about the colonial history of our town? How has your gaze been shifted about that history? What document surprised you the most? What will you share with others so that they also can see the enslaved people who helped to build our community? how does our past shape the way that we are living today? And we would welcome you in the Wintonbury Historical Society to join us as we continue to research the story of slavery in our town. I believe that Ruth Marchetti is going to give you her email address in the chat. You can certainly contact her if you'd be interested in joining us in this important research project, which is going to continue for a long time in the future. And again, thank you for taking part in this webinar.
David,
Yes.
Kathy is asking, where are the ledgers and other original materials that you featured in this presentation? Where are they located?
Right. The inventory, that source was cited, they're online. I accessed them through ancestry.com. The baptismal records were found at the family search facility here at the Mormon Church, Church of the Latter-day Saints in Bloomfield. They have a very helpful research library where you can access primary documents and do genealogical research.
Jan had a question about, were there any markers on the graves? And do we know their names?
I have walked through the seminary twice. I have not come across any markers that would indicate that a person had once been enslaved. I'm not even sure that most of the graves of the enslaved people even have a headstone. I think at one point in time, someone did go through the graveyard there on Tungus Avenue and record a list of the graves. So that would be worth trying to locate.
Another thing is, Tali was asking, can you talk a little bit more in the 1700s where enslaved people were brought from? And were there slave auctions at that time in the Northeast?
Oh yes, there were slave auctions. Hartford was a port on the Connecticut River, of course. We saw that there was a slave auction in Middletown. There were auctions certainly in New London, a very major port. Was there more to that question?
Just where the slaves were coming from. She was questioning if they came from the South or if they came from other places.
No, again, that triangle, we were actually exporting some enslaved Native Americans, some indigenous people, taken in the Pequot Wars and other wars, bringing them to the West Indies. And then on the return trip, the ships would come back with people who had been kidnapped in Africa and brought to the Caribbean, and who were then brought to New England.
I also wanted to mention, I think it's very important to know what Tracy had written about. There is a law in the state of Connecticut which says that high schools have to offer a class in Black history. Some of the members of the Wintonbury Historical Society have been working on a curriculum, and that is something that is actively being worked on. It is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And Mara, can I add here, this is Tracy,
Sure.
that we've found evidence of, and I'm not sure about Windsor, we've done more research in Hartford, but of people in Hartford who owned land and plantations in Antigua and Barbados. And so they were certainly growing sugar cane there, but they were also trafficking in humans as well.
As to the question about the cemetery inscription, Janice has said that it was done in 1934 as a WPA project by the Connecticut State Library, and it is available online.
Thank you, Jan.
And so does Janice know if there are any people of African descent that are marked in the cemetery? In that survey, I wonder. In West Hartford, where I've done most of my research, we have the gravestone of one person named Bristow, who we also have a school named after now, but just one out of 95 people now that we know were enslaved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do want to
Janice
emphasize
doesn't
that there were more enslaved people than the three that we have talked about in this webinar. We're not exactly sure of how many there were enslaved, but certainly far more than three. We're going to be continuing to do that research.
Tali has a question. Let me try and unmute you, Tali. Go ahead, Tali.
I was wondering if David or if you or Tracy could say just a little bit about the Witness Stones project. I was so struck at how you started, David, with that picture of the mural and the importance of a rose being seen. I thought that was a really powerful and beautiful way to make the point of how important it is to be known and seen, and to kind of uncover the history of human beings who were enslaved, who have been, hidden in our history. So I was curious, it made me think about the Witness Stones project. And I also was really moved by Tracy saying that one of the schools in West Hartford is now named after one of the enslaved people. And so I'm wondering what more we can do to bring these names and human beings' lives forward so that, they can be seen as part of our community as they were from the beginning.
Tracy, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Sure. I think that's a next step now. The first step is doing the research and telling the story and figuring out the story in the context of the colonial period and of colonial Wintonbury. And then the third part really is the civic engagement part of, how do you amplify this story, and how does the story get repeated and known? And as Anika Noni Rose would say, how do these people get seen? And so there are certainly lots of ways to do that. One being the Witness Stones project, which puts a stone in the ground with the enslaved person's name and something about them and the years that they lived, so that name isn't lost. And I don't know if there are other naming possibilities. In West Hartford, we changed the name of a street. We got the name of a person who died fighting in the Revolutionary War on the Revolutionary War Monument. And so there's a number of different ways to commemorate and remember. And in the Juneteenth celebration each year, we actually read the names of all the people that we know were enslaved here. Now, when we started, we had 29 names in West Hartford, and now we have Those are the ones in the church records, just to give you an idea. Now we have triple that number of names that we've learned about through looking at inventories and probate records. No, that takes some community engagement, and it can be done through students in the school, it can be done through the Historical Society, it can be done through a group of people getting together, and my guess is it would be the will of the town council to do some of this work as well.
Tracy, I wanted to go on and say two more questions for either you or for David.
Okay.
I wanted to know, were there free Blacks in Winterbury? And if so, any idea of how many?
And can I just say, Mara, I think Ruth was going to put her email
She
address in.
did.
Oh,
She did. Ruth
I don't
Ann's
know.
info is there for
Okay, I
anyone
guess I
who
missed
needs
that.
it. And
Oh,
I
great.
just
Terrific.
want to go on and try
Yep.
and answer some of the questions.
Yep.
For Bob, were there free Blacks in Winterbury? If so, any idea of how many?
Yes, there were some free Blacks. We didn't get into the legal aspects of slavery in Connecticut, but the legislature did eventually pass a law freeing enslaved people after they reached the age of 25. I don't think the law was always followed, but that was the intent at least. So eventually there were people who had been in captivity who were freed. I think in the 1840 census, there might have been 6 Black people who were no longer enslaved in Bloomfield.
And then Jacqueline, sorry, I think of Jacqueline as Jackie, has 2 questions for us. She wanted to know if any of the enslaved were sent back to Africa like the Mendy were in Farmington. And her second question is, were the church balconies built to separate the enslaved from the white citizens?
No. The Bloomfield congregation grew very rapidly. They didn't need the balcony space for the white members, but the enslaved were put in the very last pew, way up top in the balcony originally. That was common in a lot of colonial churches.
And as far as being sent back to Africa, I would say in the 1820s, there's a African colonization movement that starts up, and with formation of the country of Liberia. And there were some people of African descent who chose to go back, but many said, I was born here and this is my country. And there certainly was dissension in the Black community about that movement. And the Mendy were not, I guess I wouldn't say they were sent back, but they were allowed to go back because there were a couple of them who actually, I think there were a few who actually stayed here.
I also wanted, Jan had a question. Is there any record of Congregational Church taking a stand against slavery?
Well, I would say it's interesting right now. If you look on I think it's called the First Congregational Church of Bloomfield. If you look on their website, there's sort of an about us thing that tells the history. And that description very quickly turns to abolition. And doesn't really talk about the fact that there was that the first minister enslaved 2 people. So it's just interesting about the way the history is told. And one of the things we talk about is shifting people's gaze and saying, you know, it's okay to include that in this description, but we're often quick to jump to abolition and the Underground Railroad and sort of skip over this whole um, well, historians would say slavery lasted longer in Connecticut than it did in Georgia. And so slavery was here for a long time. And I think what David is saying is we really need to recognize this.
And Jackie, I hope you don't mind me calling you Jackie. Were there any Native Americans kept as slaves?
The white settlers found that it wasn't very efficient to keep enslaved Native Americans here in the colonies because the natives knew their way around. They could speak easily to their fellow tribespeople living nearby. It was much more convenient to ship them off to the West Indies, where they would then be put among all the Black people, and they wouldn't know the language. It would be much harder for the enslaved Native Americans to collaborate with the enslaved Black people to form any kind of a rebellion.
And I think I would add to that after King Philip's War in 1676, there were many people were taken as prisoners of war. And there's a lot of evidence of intermarriage between, and as prisoners of war, they were held sort of as indentured servants, often in the same household as someone who enslaved people as well. And we know of a family in New London where they enslaved a man and had an indentured servant who was a Pequot, and they had children. And then the question is raised about whether slavery is passed on to those children. And in one of the wills, we looked at a freedom date was put in there. When you reach the age of 30, when you reach the age of 32, they were, the will at least said that these people would be free, but we have evidence that at least 2 of them were never freed.
Yeah, our treatment of the indigenous people is another sad story. Stiles boasts in his history of ancient Windsor that the Europeans paid the native people for the land, but he goes on to make it clear that the Native Americans really didn't understand the whole concept of owning land. They thought that they could still hunt and fish and pick berries, etc., on the land that they had sold to the English people. They didn't have that, understand what it meant to give up the right to that land. And sadly, Stiles mentions that the Pequannock people moved their camp closer to the English fort there in Windsor, hoping that the English settlers would protect them from their Mohegan enemies to the north and the Pequots to the south. And unfortunately, the English settlers brought with them smallpox, which wiped out pretty much that whole Native American camp. They were in no position to resist the encroachment of the white settlers on their land.
David, Jacqueline wants to know, was Bloomfield originally named Wintonbury? And if yes, why did the name change?
Yeah, it was originally Wintonbury Parish. Francis Gillette is credited with changing the name from Wintonbury to Bloomfield, and no one is really sure why that change was made.
I wanted to just make sure that everybody knows that Ruth Ann Marchetti, her email is here. It's her first name with a dot in between her last name @gmail.com. So I'm just going to spell it out. It's RUTHANNE.MARCHETTI@gmail.com. The Wintonbury Historical Society is open to anyone, and we are looking for volunteers. We are looking for people to get involved. It's a wonderful organization. let me just say, David, Janice has a question.
Hmm.
Oh, just a statement. The name Bloomfield started when the town was incorporated in 1835. And I think I'm going to do a last call for questions, comments. So please put them in if you have them. On a personal note, myself, Libby, David, and John Capodanno, we were all thrilled with how much we learned from Tracy Wilson and how much she worked with us so that we could have this presentation, but especially to David, who did a ton of research, a ton of work, and was able to educate us so well today.
Thank you.
Does anybody, Tracy, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
No, I just want to thank the library and the Bloomfield Public Library and the Wintonbury Historical Society for setting up this chance. And I would to tell this story and to welcome the Bloomfield community to hear the story. There were more than 70 people who came on this today, which is really fantastic. So I hope this is the start of more research and really well done by this team.
And I wanted to stress how active and vibrant the Wintonbury Historical Society is. We meet on a regular basis, and we are always looking. And I'm saying we because I am also on the board of the Wintonbury Historical Society. It's an honor and a delight to be on the board. And Allison also is our liaison from Bloomfield Public Library. So we have a lot of hard people working, but we can always use more people. So please reach out to Ruth Ann because we would love to embrace you and have you. And thank you, everybody, for a wonderful presentation. We hope to see you in May for the Great River, the Great Flood of 1955. Take care.
Thank you.